this important pedagogical experiment from Moscow in the 1920s. Anna's book explores the ideas, values, and resultant work from this unique pedagogical model, in addition to its impressive collection of images and archival materials. I personally think this book is a definitely invaluable contribution to the study of architecture education, as well as to our understanding of architecture of Russian avant-garde. And it's also an important resource for educators and students as well to reflect on our education and our role as we are currently experiencing a pedagogical shift. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us today. Before turning it over to Anna, I want to remind our audience that you're also invited to ask questions on Zoom. And please join me welcoming Anna Bokov. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to lecture. It's an honor and a pleasure. During the pandemic, I had also the pleasure of walking by the Rubinstein Commons by Stephen Hall Architects at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton on almost a daily basis, and imagining what it would be like when it will open, and of course, having it exceed all expectations. Observing the project under construction brought a number of associations to the fore, from unexplored dimensions of the avant-garde structures to colliding forms of cubist sculptures and experimental study models. Stephen Hall's rigorous form-finding process made me think of some of the radical explorations in art and architecture of the early 20th century, a period that has been my focus for quite some time now, specifically looking at the links between experimental pedagogy and innovative design, a topic which is central to my first book, and thank you so much for introducing it, which came out during my time at the IAS, and explores the higher art and technical studios known as FUTIMAS, a revolutionary school that merged art and industrial production about a century ago. Often referred to as the Soviet Bauhaus, the school was the first to advance radical design pedagogy on a mass scale by proposing to treat art and architecture as science and recasting education as experiment. The IAS, of course, has its own set of foundational principles, central among which was the unobstructed pursuit of knowledge and continuous advancement of its frontiers. As the Institute's founding director, Abraham Flexner, keenly observed, this kind of research, similarly to artistic creativity, benefits from a special environment. And I quote, "The pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is not a product that can be made to order," he argued. Flexner thought of the Institute as a paradise for scholars, and indeed it was. This is the famous Institute Woods, who, and I quote, "like poets and musicians, have won the right to do as they please and to accomplish most when enabled to do so." In a number of ways, I believe T-Space campus here at Rhinebeck has become a paradise for architects as well as for artists and poets and musicians. The Rubinstein Commons is an embodiment of the Institute's mission of bringing great minds together, interpreting Flexner's idea as a community, as interconnectedness of social and physical form, and forging deeper connections, or intertwining, as Hall calls it, which go beyond mechanical programming, bringing to life the intuitive, experiential, and phenomenological aspects of architecture. The other concept central to the design, according to Hall, is that of the social condenser, which in fact is central to a number of his projects. The type of spatial organization that Hall developed allows one to use the space in multiple ways, from individual repose to collaborative interaction, and of course, variety of collective events. But what exactly do we mean by referring to social condenser, and what is its significance for modern architecture? What did the term mean originally, and what are its larger cultural implications? Those were some of the questions that I addressed in a short piece I wrote for the IAS. and exploring and trying to unpack some of the lessons from the social condensers. That became the subject of my new book, published last year. And I'm happy to be here at T-Space, in fact, to have the opportunity to thank Stephen across the ocean, but still, for inspiring this topic, as his work gave me the impetus, actually, to revisit this idea of the social condenser, something I have been also interested for a while, and explore the correlations between its historical significance and its relevance for today. And I'll also like to use this opportunity to thank the Center for Advanced Studies in Art of Architecture, the ETH in Zurich, where I spent the following year and where the book became reality. And this, by the way, in the following blue images are stills from a video by Spatzer Project, very cool. And also to thank the publisher, Getae Verlag, and the amazing team, Moritz Gleis, Jennifer Bartmans, and others, and the incredible designer, Theo Schifferle, who managed to bring and unify this multitude of diverse graphic materials into a kind of coherent whole. And also Philip Hirschsprung, who supported the research and wrote the foreword for this book. In this lecture, I'd like to unpack the concept of the social condenser as manifested in the workers' clubs and palaces of culture, a building typology conceived specifically to promote Soviet culture in the early 20th century. Originally envisioned as an instrument of social engineering, this typology tests the agency of architecture's collective infrastructure, not only to shape individual behaviors, but also to reform society at large. While the spaces are deeply rooted in the discipline of architecture, they must also be considered through the lenses of society, politics, ideology, economics, and of course, culture. The term social condenser was coined by constructivist architects in the 1920s, and particularly by Moisei Ginzburg, whose communal housing project I'm showing here, and was popularized internationally beginning in the 1960s by Anatole Kopp, Henri Lefebvre, Kenny Frampton, Rem Koolhaas, and Stephen Hall. Constructivists sought to introduce a new social type in which, and I quote, all the elements and parts of a building, without exception, stem from their social and technical function. I'm sorry for the long quote. The modernist dictum was to be applied to a range of architectural and urban structures, including communal housing, workers' clubs, houses of labor, administrative buildings, and even factories. All of this were supposed to become conductors and condensers of socialist culture. And this new typology was opposed to the old ones, the outdated building types, products of pre-revolutionary circumstances. So the term condenser, of course, is a metaphor borrowing from scientific disciplines, such as this contraption that is used to condense a gaseous substance into liquid state through the process of cooling. In doing so, the latent heat that's released by the substance is transferred to the surrounding environment. So while communal housing and administrative buildings and factories were all conditioned to be this condensers and conductors of socialist culture, the mandate, I would argue, was most consistently manifested in and interpreted through the typology of the workers' clubs and palaces of culture, this kind of communal public buildings. These buildings and projects conceived as structures for mass assembly, according to these ideas, are some of the earliest radical architectural experiments of the modern movement. Yet, despite their impact on the canonized history of modernism, there has been surprisingly little insight into this considerable body of work as a whole. So the goal of my research was to unpack that notion of condenser by proposing a typological organization, a taxonomy of projects, that reflects the historical development of the typology and at the same time traces the way it functioned as a social and spatial institutional network. And the research as a whole was conceived as a kind of comprehensive, though by no means exhaustive, inventory of 101 projects. One of my main objectives was to demonstrate the vastness, both formally and conceptually, of this architectural typology. Both built and unbuilt, and built or unbuilt. These projects presented a wide variety of spatial and programmatic solutions, often deploying dynamic expressive spatial language. Their architecture was meant to conduct a host of collective activities, But at the center of each one, there was always a core space, meeting hall or an auditorium, shown in red. So this is where they're a little bit like egg yolks. Workers' clubs and palaces of culture were conceived as the principal place of acculturation and the site of most innovative architectural experiments. In the 1920s, the majority of these projects were commissioned and realized by the labor unions in response to the statewide initiative of spreading proletarian culture. With their dynamic forms, these buildings shocked gritty industrial areas. And the areas that actually were still using horse and carriage, you can see there in the bottom. So the contrast was must have been really great, and offering real life glimpses of the bright communist future, which never materialized. Yet many of the buildings are still there today as relics of the bygone era. And many have fallen into despair, while some have received a second life as cultural institutions. And to give you a sense of scale, here's a comparison with the Guggenheim Museum on the left, in the same scale. So they were quite large. My book catalogs a selection of this 101 realized and unrealized projects, ranging from experimental visions and to standardized buildings designed and constructed across the former Soviet Union during the period between the Revolution of 1917 and the onset of the World War II in 1941. So this is roughly the period. Even though the palaces and houses of culture were being constructed in the USSR, of course, after the World War II and throughout the regimes of Stalin and Khrushchev, in a way continuing the lineage of the social condensers, but the typology in the revolutionary sense, in my view, ceased to exist, as the labor unions, who were the original clients and users of buildings, were stripped of their power and financial resources in the 1930s with the rise of the totalitarian regime. Yet the concept of the social condenser continued to fascinate architects and historians throughout the ensuing decades. Anatol Kopp discovered it, or rediscovered it, just in time for the term to gain new relevance in the revolutionary events of the late 1960s in France. And he highlights the social condenser and its built manifestations or unbuilt manifestations as a potential recipe for a more socially engaged architecture. Koolhaas played a key role in popularizing the term by filing a patent for the social condenser in 1982 as part of the Parc de la Villette competition proposal shown here. He actually made numerous visits to the USSR in the 70s and even publicly declared the affinity for the architecture of Ivan Leonidov, whose diploma project from Khutimas you can see here. According to Kenneth Frampton, Leonidov was the key figure, and I quote, haunting the stage of the 20th century and defining the poetic architecture of the social condenser. Stephen Hall used the term, I would say more liberally in his architecture, ameliorated through formal concepts such as compression and intertwining. And this image is on the cover of an exquisite monograph of Hall's architecture by Robert McCarter. For Hall, the notion of social condensing is central to the design process and outcome, shaping ways in which architectural space can foster collective activity and even collective creativity, a concept that was also widely discussed in the turn of the century, and capturing the spirit and energy of social interaction. So going back to the research and the history of the typology, I will touch on topics of origins and concepts, function and purpose, process and context, and experiments and standards moving forward. In terms of origins, like the revolutionaries before them, the Bolsheviks sought to rewrite social relations and reimagine the entire society, a task that required not only introducing a new aesthetic vocabulary, but also modernizing the entire outdated spatial paradigm that they inherited. According to the polymath artist and architect L. Lisitsky, the first steps of the Soviet experiment were modeled on the projects of the French Revolution, such as, of course, Senator for Newton, or projects for Church of New Nation or Temple of Great Men. Suspending all utilitarian restrictions, architecture was to be reimagined as a powerful symbolic form, following in the footsteps of the French visionaries. Visionary proposals such as Tautman's Monument to the Third International, or Nikolai Ladovsky's projects for Temple for Communication of the People, designed the same year, for which he developed several versions, and the plan of one of which became the cover of the book. As well as small-scale experiments such as agitation and propaganda kiosks all played a formative role in shaping the social condensers as a distinct typology. These design explorations tapped into the agency of architecture to reorganize modes of social interaction and political engagement. Throughout the 1920s, the notion of a great house of utopia, to quote Kandinsky, representing all nations and symbolizing the new social order, crystallized as the fundamental theme in the Soviet architecture, that of the mass assemblies. So the competition for the Palace of Labor held in 1922, shown here and won by the Vesnin brothers, represented, according to Lisitsky, and I quote, the first attempt to create a new form for a social task that in itself was still ill-defined at the time. So in other words, they're figuring out what it is, not only what it's going to look like, but what it is that they're doing in terms of program and concept and everything else that that meant. So in fact, also this project gave birth to constructivism in architecture. So versus in art, that was already there, but in architecture, this is the beginning. Conceived at the time as the main building of the country, Palace of Labor, became an unlikely prototype for the Palace of the Soviets a decade later, in 1932, a result of a multi-stage competition and its winning entry by Boris Serafan. The project, which continued to expand in all directions, but mostly vertically, in the following years, this is 5 years later, became a culmination of the new ideology and changed the course of Soviet architecture from modernism to socialist realism, or what I call proto-postmodernism. Throughout the 1920s, the notion of a model of a building dedicated to the great utopia, to quote Kandinsky, symbolizing the new social order, emerged as a fundamental theme in the Soviet experiment. Not only did Kandinsky predict the existence of such a model more than a decade into the future, he also anticipated that it would never be built. It's one of the most beautiful quotes. It takes a while to get through it, but the utopia of architecture as a project is another quote by Anthony Vidler, late Anthony Vidler, who, as if responding to Kandinsky across time, wrote this, and I'll read it in a second. But what's interesting is, of course, Vidler was the author of multiple texts on French Revolutionary architecture. So this is where this conversation kind of comes in. The utopia of architecture's project might be progressive in its ends or nostalgic in its dreams, but at heart, it was founded on the premise that the shape of environments might, like nature herself, affect and hereby control the individual and collective relations of man. Social condensers expanded the canonical modernist formula of form-following function by envisioning an architecture where a form would presumably follow a larger purpose. First and foremost, the new typology sought to fulfill a utopian mission. Its entire programmatic composition and spatial organization were intended to condition social behavior through a series of orchestrated collective experiences. While assembly, performance, entertainment, education, collective creativity, and political acculturation were all central to the mission of the social condenser. It was neither a church, nor city hall, nor theater, nor library, nor museum in a traditional sense. It was to become a radically new hybrid building type. This is a photo by Alexander Rodchenko of the Rusakov Club. A temple of new cult, to quote some of its early theories, that would replace traditional religious institutions. In fact, the replacement often meant physical, well, reconstruction, or to use contemporary term, adaptive reuse, such as in the example shown here, where it's the same building captured over the course of the 2 decades. And in fact, it was a popularized project by the constructivist architect Alexander Nikolsky, who published an article on it in Contemporary Architecture magazine. So the step one is to cut off the domes. The other famous case of such replacement was this medieval monastery being taken apart here to make room for a new palace of culture designed by the Vesnin brothers, who we already met, the same group, of course, who designed the Palace of Labor. So in fact, no room physically was necessary, as there's plenty of room next to it. But to give you a sense, so this is the part that got built, and this is it's overlapped onto the monastery. And only a portion of the project was built. So only this part was built, not this grand auditorium. So this is the zeal or the proletarian palace of culture. And to give you a sense, this is the remnants of the monastery walls with the part of the auditorium right here. As spaces for mass assembly, these buildings became the prime instruments of the so-called socialist reconstruction. Their effectiveness as conduits of the new ideology was, of course, substantially higher than that of factory buildings or even communal housing, whose primary functions lay outside this specific mandate. As such, these universities of culture, as Lisitsky called them, immediately became the symbol for a manifestation of this new social order, achieving the purpose through a diverse set of architectural means. So all sorts of spaces, big and small, intertwining, in fact, I would say this is very appropriate here, that emerge throughout the buildings. And it's not an accident that certain aspects of this Vesnin Brothers project remind us of Le Corbusier's work, because in fact, they were quite close throughout the 1920s. So here you could see the master Le Corbusier surrounded by the Vesnin brothers and also another architect, modern architect Bouloff. So in the throughout the 20s. Workers' clubs, as well as houses and palaces of culture, were conceived as both polyfunctional spaces and programmatic hybrids. Lectures, classes, exhibitions, rehearsals, concerts, plays, celebrations, political assemblies were all regular part of the daily club activities. So this is in fact one of the clubs by Konstantin Melnikov, who designed half a dozen and realized half a dozen of those buildings in a very, very short amount of time, between 1927 and 1930 roughly. And I quote him, so the endless variety of club activities, such as the ones I named already, could never be accommodated in one room. There needs to be, this need will be met only by a system of halls that can, if necessary, be connected to each other. And so this approach is reflected basically in all of his building, regardless of their size, I would say. Like, for example, here we have this flower-shaped plan for those practice sections. You can see there, this in the photograph, and then here it is. And this is the interior space. And then all sorts of other spaces that compose the club. So including the, of course, assembly and educational part, also administration part, the gym here, etc. Such system of halls, for example, was proposed by Melnikov also for the competition entry for the Zuev Club, which he lost to Bolsov. And here it is resolved as 5 intersecting cylindrical forms, a strategy that he tested in his private residence with just 2 cylinders. Golosov used, the other architect, Golosov used the cylindrical form in his winning entry, which he termed architectural organism, to explain his method for condensing multiple programs into a single spatial volume. The theory of architectural organism, which Golosov developed and taught at Futimas, focused on harmonious relations of spatial forms, something that's commonly referred to as composition. In the case of Zuev Club, condensing happens in the grand spiral staircase volume, which is, of course, commands the exterior, and then leads to this tranquil multi-use space upstairs where people have drawing classes, music recitals, etc. During the peak of club construction around 1927, with hundreds of projects in the works, the typical program, or in fact programs, there are several groups of them, developed by the labor unions contained the following elements: foyer, auditorium, recreation room, library, reading room, practice sections, administration, playroom, and all sorts of exterior spaces. So a canonical social condenser, therefore, would need to have this variety of large and small, open and enclosed areas to accommodate all these different activities. The number of problematic components required for even the very basic club, like this is one of the first ones in Mimic designed, to develop some kind of way to fit all of this, or at least part of it. So for one, it meant arranging the spaces that they could perform separately and together. And so in this case, Melnikov resolved this in section, not in plan. So by stacking them above and around the auditorium, that of course is here protruding on the facade and kind of registering on the exterior. And while the auditorium was at the core of every club building, such as this, let's say, semicircular auditorium in another Melnikov project, the Culture Club, and again, shaping the exterior form, it was the foyer, I would argue, that played a key role as a kind of flexible space, serving as a buffer from the street, as an overflow area for an auditorium, as a rehearsal space, and most importantly, as a space for informal encounter and socialization. So in this club, the foyer is linked directly to the auditorium. So this is a diagram of the culture, allowing it to breathe and operate as an interconnected unit. Auditorium was simultaneously a space for meetings and performances, for official use and for entertainment. And because it had to house such disparate activities and even adjust its capacity, it had to be flexible, universal space. So Tasca became a subject of, again, much architectural experimentation and also later criticism, interestingly enough. But this here is a project by Nikolai Ladovsky, again, a person who we already met with the Temple for Communication of the People. In this project, Ladovsky develops a stage as a hinge between the canteen and an auditorium, which can operate then as a single system, but also could be phased in terms of its construction. So some of the most interesting experiments involved attempts to articulate the auditorium, both internally and externally, revealing and even showcasing the activity of the club users and making them therefore part of the public domain. So this, for example, in Rusakov Club, the kind of the porch, let's say, the balcony becomes part of the street processions and also communicates with the street from the auditorium. Fusing the life of the street and therefore with the life of the club, which is very integral to the club mission. With this three auditoria sitting volumes, or to use, again, Stephen Paul's term, three performative trapezoids cantilevering outward as if turning the building inside out. And you can see this in section and elevation here, so the protruding auditoria seating. Sorry for the bad quality of the photo. This is an original scan of one of the many publications that actually came out during the time of the club construction and just completion of the construction in the 20s. So in between the auditorium sections, Melnikov envisioned movable partitions, allowing the space to expand and contract from basically three smaller halls to one larger ones. And you can see that in this diagram. So the inclusion of what he called living walls was designed to greatly increase the flexibility by allowing this one hall to be transformed to accommodate events of various sizes. And this concept reminds me actually also of the idea of the hinge space that is essential to several of those projects for Fukuoka housing in Japan, but also, of course, storefront. And since the theme of this year's T-Space residency is correlations, I couldn't help but notice some formal correlations between say this project, this new project by Hall, the Student Performing Arts Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and the historical typology. And here the 3 performative trapezoids dancing in the rendering. And another recently completed project by student architects, the Institute for Contemporary Art at Virginia Commonwealth University, where the dynamism of internal spaces is expressed on the exterior, showcases this abandoned energy within. The assembly function in the projects from the 1920s, usually took precedence over the performance. So rendering them actually somewhat unsuitable for professional theater with, of course, many demanding technical requirements such as acoustics, lighting, stage props, etc. So by the 1930s, that was changing. In other words, this performative function became more important. And to solve this challenge, the larger clubs and palaces of culture, such as ZIL, for example, here, would have more than one auditorium. So one for assemblies and meetings and one for professional stage theatrics. And here is this internal view of that auditorium. And you can see that it can really host a variety of professional performances. And this is the exterior view to give you a sense of its scale. So this is a rather large, massive space. But in fact, this typology of celebrating mass spectacle and being able to host really mass assemblies with thousands of people emerged in the 1930s with several major design competitions, such as this one for the so-called synthetic theater. And by the way, all of this is in the book, so there's the references and everything if you're interested. And this project, for example, for mass musical theater, also by the Weston brothers, we envisioned a new kind of space for mass assembly, drawing on the so-called total theater. So that typology, total theater, was pioneered by Gropius and his project for Evan Pescator, where spectators enabled by dynamic features were not just passive viewers, but active participants in the theatrical action. So the stage would move and change and rotate to accommodate various kinds of activities. The other component that was essential to the social condenser program was athletics. So that would include both gymnasium and outdoor athletic fields, sometimes even a freestanding auditorium. So, but in this rendering by Dianeka, I thought it was also interesting to point out that you could see the club building here nested between 2 churches, so that, of course, the club was set to replace and offer alternatives to this new, to the old way of life. A large club, so this is again the ZIL Palace of Cultures, athletic facilities would typically be located next to the building as part of its grounds and include running track, soccer fields, playgrounds, and a range of outdoor leisure activities. In fact, the territories were very, very important for the club as a building. So it wasn't just a building, it was always a kind of a small campus or a large campus in this case. Various forms of cultural leisure, from informal games to grandiose choreographed spectacles, became the essential component of the new typology, as demonstrated by this very ambitious proposal by Ivan Leonidov. This is his losing entry for the ZIL Palace of Culture, with its fields for so-called mass actions. And this proposal is from 1930. Leonidov argued for a different approach to the social condenser, one at odds with the typology that had taken shape over the previous few years. And Anatol Kopp explains, and I quote, "The year 1928 witnessed a mutation in club architecture. In spite of all their innovations, the existing clubs, even the most modern, such as those designed by Melnikov and Volosov that I've shown, were sharply criticized for being centered on the stage and tied to the professional theater." So you can see there's a lot of back and forth. So on the one hand, they were tied to the professional theater. On the other hand, they weren't quite sufficient in that, in their performative function. The club of a new social type, proposed by Leonidov in 2 versions, included actual laboratories for in-depth analytical research, alongside zones for mass activities, as varied as athletic competitions, demonstrations, or productivity achievements. The club would also host elements of new lifestyle, so those were film, radio, television, air travel, photography, etc. And Kenny Frampton writes, and I quote, "At their most ephemeral, Leonidov's project are not so much designed as they're posited. A geodesic dome here, a glazed pyramid there, an architecture degree 0, whose elaborative intent transcends the culture of tectonic form." Consisting of several disparate structures, whether with specific programs or intended for universal use, Leonidov's projects were conceived not as discrete buildings, of course, like his contemporaries, but as a system of infrastructural elements. Social condensers also required an entirely new set of interiors, furniture, and equipment. And this is something what constructivist artist and educator Alexander Rodchenko called the armature of everyday life. This was the subject of active experimentation in his Futema studios and in design community in general. Futema students in the workshops of Rodchenko, of Lisitsky, of Fontane-Lavinsky expanded the scope of these design principles by developing transformative universal elements and equipment for multi-purpose applications, or also like this project for the Village Club transformed a traditional log cabin into a communal space for public meetings and adult education. The model of that was shown in the Paris Art Deco exhibition in 1925. And the interior, which I showed briefly in the beginning, the idea is that you could really outfit any vernacular structure with this modern programming and make it into the club. Rodchenko's project for the Workers' Club, commissioned also as part of the Paris exhibition, was conceived as an interior prototype, so which could become a component of a larger facility or exist independently. Shaped as a generic rectangular room, it was furnished with lightweight productivist furniture, including a vitrine for exhibiting books and magazines, a common table and chairs, library wall for displays of posters, maps, and newspapers, as well as a centerpiece, a multifunctional, transformable, and I quote, installations for meetings, rallies, and performances of the living newspaper. So living newspaper was a type of performance where a group would basically kind of entertain the public by showing them various small bits of news, essentially what we have today in a televised format, but back then they did it in a very theatrical format, and thus highlighting the importance of media in architecture. Another central element was a red and black chess station, which brought together two types of furniture, so chairs and a table, into a single unit, a kind of utilitarian aggregate. Rodchenko considered principles of expediency and economy to be fundamental to any modern object. A Lisitsky studio at Futema's developed the standard space-saving folding chair, featured in one of the numerous period publications on workers' clubs. And this book, for example, which is really a manual on the principles and methods of club work, was one of the ways in which the knowledge of how to operate a social club or social condenser was disseminated. And you can see it sold in this kiosk. This is it. So it was really something that people could buy and then use to set up their own spaces. In a 1932 publication featuring a selection of recently completed club buildings in the Soviet capital, the only consistent feature for the typology or of the typology was basically its nonconformist variety, with each example having a distinctive architectural identity in its exterior appearance as well as in plan. Still, while club buildings were subject to radical formal experimentation and intense professional debates, and here's a project by Alexander Nikolsky, the same person who did the church adaptive reuse, by the way, a year earlier. They were simultaneously undergoing a reductive process of streamlining and standardization. As the primary clients and users of workers' clubs, labor unions played a key role in shaping the typology and articulating elements, functions, and goals of the clubs, developing numerous iterations of the problem, and experimenting with different architectural solutions. So this, in fact, documents the project of the standard project, won by, I'm sure rendering, was one of the largest competitions that was held by the Textile Labor Union, where several versions of standard clubs were developed and then realized according to several winning entries. So this one is by Leonid Vesnin, one of the Vesnin brothers. And you can see this sort of very, very simple, very humble project. And at least 5 of those were built of this particular one. And then a larger, even a larger open competition was conducted by the Railroad Workers Union at the end of 1926 with the goal, and I quote, of finding an appropriate architectural expression capable of addressing existing notion of hygiene, comfort, and aesthetics. So here there were hundreds of entries, several winners were selected, and then a few again buildings were realized, a number of buildings were realized according to several schemes. So here we have a club proposal for 500 people, and this is for 1,000 people. And there's another version, also winning version of the club for 1,000 people. Despite many inventive architectural propositions, both standardized and experimental, the functionality of the social condenser was still defined largely by compromise, I would say. Its theatrical part was often too primitive to support professional activities and productions. Its educational facilities and practice sections were often limited and unfit for whatever activity they were supposed to house. The club's recognizable yet uncompromising forms make them a peculiar challenge to adapt to the present day. They're all too likely to be seen as little more than political slogans of the past, cast in concrete. And arguably, no other structures have brought together so many disparate functions with the same intensity, only to leave them paralyzed in their condensed state. Yet, while these universities of culture have outlived their original function, spreading the tenets of Soviet ideology, they might still offer valuable insight into the precarious relationship between architecture and society at large. So this is, I think, about maybe even less than 50 minutes, but I would like to open the conversation to your questions and comments. So thank you. Okay. So should I do it? Oh. There's a question from Violet de la Salle. Wonderful. Hello, Violet. So how does the meaning of the word social in relation to the social condenser differ from the use of the word today? Oh, that's a great question. And let me see if I can, should I stop sharing? So, yeah, okay, great. I can see maybe. So Violet, in fact, also is the co-founder of an amazing social space in the city in Manhattan called City Group. And we host all sorts of amazing events and competitions and exhibitions. And hopefully there will be also a bit of discussion on the social condensers in their space in the coming year. So the difference, I would say, the difference was, the large difference was that it was more ideological and politically charged. Today, I think we are, at least we were more, I think, dealing with or thinking of it in a cultural sense and educational sense, maybe even entertainment, than it was much more, I think, serious, so to speak, back in the 1920s than it is today, if that helps answer it.
Hi, Anna. I want to ask a question, maybe somehow overlaps with the last question, but from a perspective, let's say a student. Um, I wonder, how do you think about the implication of this pedagogy, or let's say this lineage of practice? I mean, its implication to today's architecture pedagogy, because sometimes I feel like this pedagogy has a formal agenda, but at the same time, let's say behind, it's actually supported by a strong, less political or social agenda. But today's, I feel like architecture education, you sometimes feel either it has a strong formal agenda but does not has anything behind, or you have a very social, ethnic, or political agenda, but sometimes in lacks of a formal agenda. That's my I don't know if I expressed it clearly.
No, I think it's a very good question, very important one. And I would say start by saying that this was an optimistic time for architecture and for architects. And despite all the challenges of the everyday life and the very difficult conditions, and them just coming out of the World War I at this point, and the Civil War, and just all of that kind of terrible economic shortages, there was incredible optimism in terms of what could architecture do and how it could change not just the built environment, but also really society. And so architects were charged with this idea. And so one of the important things about the social condensers and the workers' clubs in particular is, and I showed the programs from the labor unions, but architects were actually the ones who were actively involved, and we're talking about a very large group of people. They were designing programs as well. So they were designing the actual they were scripting the space as much as they were responding to a brief. So they were the protagonists of the whole typology. And this is not just the clubs and the palaces of culture, but also communal housing and all these other buildings that were coming up, the factory kitchens, all sorts of different ways in which the society was supposed to be functioning. So it was really a comprehensive project. It was unique in a sense that meaning that in that period during the 1920s in the Soviet Union, it was a short moment, about a decade, where this kind of avant-garde energy, the energy of radical artistic experimentation, coincided, I would say, aligned briefly with the direction of the political powers. And that allowed for a kind of unprecedented scale of operation. That was then, of course, as we know, shut down around mid-1930s and kind of recalibrated and changed. And then the regime sort of took over and began to dictate to the artistic community and the architectural community what they need to be doing from that point on. But in that moment, there's really a kind of sense of agency, of optimism, and of incredible kind of ability for architecture to really affect individuals and how they live, re-educate them. There's also, of course, you have to remember that this is the moment of urbanization. So not just in the Soviet Union, but in many other parts of the world, where millions of people are migrating to the cities. So the clubs, millions of adults, right? So you actually have the clubs literally kind of demonstrating how to live. So this idea of hygiene is not just, for us, it doesn't mean anything, but today, because we're indoctrinated, we have all those facilities. But back then, that was a big part of people coming in from very rural environments into the city and becoming a whole different, entering an entirely different way of life, literally. So the clubs were those places where that could happen.
I'd like to say a few things.
Their connection. But he was with us the whole time.
Stephen, can you repeat?
I would just say it was an amazing lecture, and we live in a very, very different time now when the actual heavy steel shoes in 1932 crushed all of this. We live in another world, another time. And I was very proud to have my most social condensing piece, which is the VCU ICA building in Richmond, Virginia, in your lecture, because that's a building sits on the edge of the campus and brings together all the community on Broad Street in Richmond, Virginia, and brings them into the campus via this building, but also the students and presenting their work, and it's shown. And so this building, also the way the site it works, it has two entrances, one from one side, one from the urban side, one from the campus side. So this is as close to a social condenser that I could get, and I'm glad you included that in your lecture. And I would hope that, you know, people that are, you know, our students that are trying to make this little tiny project, the site is only 100 feet by 100 feet, but it could have some programmatic social condensing, you know, aspect to it. And how could they think about how that might be? I think it would be a challenge, and in a way would be, it's one of the things that we've done in this studio is we emphasize light and space and geometry, but you're trying to bring, you know, to try to bring some kind of an optimistic program into this little site, into this public facility, I think would be a good challenge to everybody that's trying to do a project in 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's too much, but anyway, thank you for the fantastic talk. You're wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure. And yes, I would love to actually physically go and see the Virginia project. It looks spectacular, and the torqued entry on the other side, just yeah. Really.
Also, you catch all of my secret inspirations in Melnikov. I was there. You know, I went to Moscow. I was in the Golosov building. I was in the Melnikov building. I also went to the Melnikov house. You know, there's a book called Solo Architect in a Mass Society. Melnikov was an architect for freedom. You know, he wasn't joining the party line. He was an architect about freedom, and that house is really amazing. And his grandson was still there when I went there. Vlad and Ludmila Kirpichov took me there, so I had a very fantastic moment to see that. And yes, it's a different time now, and I think the notion of a free society is also very important now on our side of the ocean.
But yeah, Melnikov was a very interesting figure, because he had this incredible period where, as a young man, he designed in just a few years and realized literally dozens of buildings and half a dozen workers' clubs. And then by early 1930s, well, I think one of his last projects is the competition similar to Leonidov in 1934. And then after that, he was essentially canceled and became the prisoner in his own house for, you know, the next 40 plus years. So he actually passed away around mid-70s. And was in his house, you know, surrounded by his paintings. He continued to paint, and his son and his grandson, therefore, also continued that lineage of being painters. But it's a rather, I would say, sobering, in some ways tragic story, because the one thing he loved the most, he was denied, which was to design architecture. And and talking about Kirpichovs, I was actually studying with them at the age of between 5 and teenage years. So they were only this, amazing creatives back in the day. So.
They're great people, and I have never been. Ever since the invasion of Ukraine, I have not been able to connect with them. I keep sending them texts, emails. So somehow the communication system might be shut down by the government. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, if you have a way of connecting with them, please give them my regards and ask them to send me a text or a message.
Okay. Okay, I'll look for them. Yeah, we should be able to find them there. They do live in several different places as well. So, in Belize. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Sorry. So we have a question from the physical audience, and then
Okay.
Emily will take yours in a second.
Sure.
If it's right. Yeah. Okay.
Did the social condensers have a lasting effect on Soviet society?
Yes, for sure. So first of all, they were there are many of them, and so this idea of the 101, it was funny because I knew there was a lot of buildings and projects, and it's one of those situations where once you start, or let's say go deeper into the research, it opens itself up. So it becomes like a kind of like an oil, what would be the geyser, where it just goes at you. And so at some point there were 70 condensers, and there was 80, and then all of a sudden there was 100, and then I realized there are hundreds, and there's so I stopped at 101 as an idea that this is a primer. This is a like the 101 lesson in architecture, and so in other words that those structures, and some of them got destroyed also there, in the recent years, unfortunately. So I talk about that in the book as well. They're still there. Some of them are landmarks, and some of them are no longer there. But for decades, they were part of the urban fabric and a part of people's everyday life. So after their kind of very political educational focus, they became for adults also, right? And there was a big literacy problem, for example, or illiteracy, where adults would go to the social condensers and learn how to read. But then in the, let's say, post-World War II situation or scenario, they were functioning more for children. So there were a lot of various artistic sections, sports sections, photography, so this was something that was used widely, and in that way, similar to maybe community centers today, or various cultural facilities today, or the ones, and some of them were quite large and quite, let's say, well made, like the Zeal, for example, similar to, what we would today think of high-end performance halls and centers. So there's a great kind of variety of them depending on the scale, the location, and other factors. So yeah, they're still there. Okay, and Emily.
Yeah, hi. I had a question about today's intention or intentionality. I'm kind of building off the two questions that were asked on Zoom. Thank you for the lecture. It was really insightful. And I couldn't help but think of an example or a precedent that was brought up in yesterday's lecture. There was this precedent of these Egyptian monks in the 2000 years ago who decided to live a life of solitude and took a vow of celibacy. So they collectively moved out to the desert, deep in the desert, so that they wouldn't talk or see each other. And slowly over time, they lived in these pods of dorms or cells, but slowly over time, they found each other to move closer into a bounded monastery. And so the resultant typology was that they built monasteries next to each other, kind of scattered around the desert. But within these communities, they lived very much individually. I thought that reminded me of the need to be unsocial. And you brought up also Stephen's example of the IIS, that this building was somewhat reclusive and it offered a paradise to scholars, as well as the X of N. I wonder about, for today's intentionality, how do we as architects and planners kind of bridge with good intentions to make correlations, bridge the individual need and willingness to collectivity?
Well, this is a very good question, and an important one, and you can answer it a number of different ways. But let's say if I answer it from the historical perspective and look at this typology back in the 1920s, so another function that they had, or role that they played rather, was that of a kind of urban or public living room. So as there is a kind of huge influx, first of all, there's a revolution, there's an influx of population from the country to the city, there's a huge shortage of housing. So this idea of minimal dwelling and the existence minimum that we continue to be fascinated by today originated back in the 20s and was not, let's say, was not accidental. It was there because people were really largely kind of, I wouldn't say homeless, but had to live in very, very substandard conditions. So in New York, for example, we know about tenement housing. In the Soviet Union, there was so-called communal apartments that existed all the way up until certainly up until 60s, but even beyond by the end of the whole Soviet Union. So people lived in substandard, let's say, one family, several families per room, for example, could be the situation, and then certainly several families per apartment. So coincidentally, that also worked with the kind of whole mission of collective living, right? So then there were projects that began to articulate it, like the Ginsburg project and Nikolaev project and many other communal housing projects that actually designed that as a way of life. Right, it's not just because there was no place to live and there was a shortage, but in fact it became an ideological message. So in other words, clubs became the place of repose where let's say the workers from a factory, instead of going directly into their communal apartment with several families per 10 square meters, they could go and spend some time in those beautiful spaces. And they were different. As I said, they were variety of spaces. They were reading rooms where you could read a book quietly. They were, game rooms where people could play chess. The chess is not, accidental. The chess really was a game that people played. They would have, special areas where they would do that. And this was a kind of part of the really the kind of this leisure activity and many other things that people could do there. So they played that role. So if you think about the city as a place to live, not just your apartment, right? The clubs were this integral part between the work and home, and then there was this social space. So, and in another aspect, and I really like your comparison with this Buddhist project that you talked about just now, I think is this idea of course, the clubs were also somehow supposed to be a replacement for religious and spiritual functions, right? That I just talked about. The church, which was very huge, religion was a huge part of the culture before 1917, and the clubs were stepping in to, and then it was outlawed, right? So the clubs were stepping in to offer an alternative to that. However this can be interpreted, but that was an important thing of what they were doing. So those assembly spaces were also places for preaching, in a way, a new type of cult, we could say. So that's another dimension that could certainly be explored and looked at more. So.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. And it somehow kind of helped me understand our residency's brief, because the site is in the very local town of Hudson, where it's mostly residential and families live in semi-detached and detached houses. So we could start to understand this public program to be as a third space between work and life.
Yeah.
And maybe a place of assembly of religion and belief, etc.
Yeah, and another thing, they don't have to be even so. In my taxonomy, I start with not buildings, but in a way, aggregates, or something that could be thought of as a sculpture or tribune. So it's actually objects that then function as kind of external organizers for the people. And then they become kiosks, and then they become those low cabins, and then they become, you know, larger sort of stations, maybe, you know, where there's 1 or 2 rooms, and then it becomes enormous, as I call them, total theaters or synthetic theaters, also built, we're talking about in the 1930s. So they really range in size. And that's another interesting, I think, thing for us to, as architects, to think of, like how, like, the idea can bridge very different scales. And I think also here in T-Space, there's such a range of different scales, and all of them, there's follies, there's houses, there are galleries, spaces for archive, spaces for assembly, right? And all of them kind of come together in a really kind of a magical, coherent way. So, in nature.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there's another question in the chat. Okay, so do I look at?
And then another panel is completed too, so you have a bunch.
Okay, the question was, did the social condensers have a lasting effect on civil society? Is that the question?
The next, in the Q&A, how do you view the role of slums?
Okay, so I'll just repeat it quickly. How do you view the role of slums in contemporary urban environments in terms of their potential as social condensers? Are we talking about like favela type? I think they're somewhat different, because the reason why we use the term social condenser is to demonstrate a certain level of intentionality, that there is a, you know, a priori kind of mission and purpose, social purpose, that the structures have. And I think the lasting relevance of the term is that it can transcend a particular political or ideological period and become and transform and evolve. And that's why I think it's interesting, because we are, and I think this was one of the things, of course, with the pandemic, where it was so clear and so visceral, the degree to which this just function of condensing, the function of assembly is important. And particularly at a place like the Institute for Advanced Study, where it's all about this mixing and you know, people from different disciplines being able to have tea on a daily basis. And then there's this incredible collaborations that start between social scientists and astrophysicists and mathematicians and historians, and it's just so beautiful. And I'm hoping I can come back there and experience it in action, because we had only sort of very short slivers of it, and certainly experience it within the walls of the Rubinstein Commons building, because that brings it to the whole other level. So there is an intentionality with as I said, with the communal apartments, which I think is a version of slums in this particular context, if we can make that analogy. That again is a kind of found condition that was then turned into the actual kind of social project. Luckily, you know, in my case, I knew that they were existing, but it wasn't something that I got to experience. But it's not necessarily, I think, social condensers still has a kind of, let's say, positive or constructive connotation, and I think if it's a choice, then that works. So I don't know if I answered the question.
It is interesting to me to compare to yesterday's lecture by Chris Park,
Mhm.
who was talking about this feeling of space. And I think he seemed to suggest that the authenticity, originality of the space happens where there is, he called it distortion,
Mhm.
or maybe disturbance, or some sort of you know, loosening. He called it leaks, you know, where the space
Yes.
leaks, you know, where
Yes.
it's less, perhaps less designed, or
Mhm.
more spontaneous,
Mhm.
where this kind of condensing or can happen. So it's very interesting to having that in mind, which is very fresh from yesterday,
Mhm.
to look at these examples where it's, as you said, it's a composition, right? It's an architectural composition. It's highly orchestrated and then designed and prescriptive in certain ways. So there is, I understand, different ways that the program can take place and be multi-program, right? But it's a stark contrast from this idea that where there is less, where there is leak, where there is disturbance of a certain order, that this kind of condensing can take place. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and this is, I think, one of the most exciting and important themes in this typology is exactly that. It's, and there's an expression I think by Flexner where he talks about the usefulness of useless knowledge, and in our case as architects, I think it's the usefulness of unscripted space, right? Where exactly it's this moments where, so you do have a certain, you know, with a, if I make the egg analogy again, there is a yolk and then there is that white matter, and that white matter is where I think much of the kind of unscripted interaction takes place, and that's where I think that idea of you know, and there's a spectrum. It goes from indoctrination to socialization, right? So there's a, I would say, somewhat problematic and then a somewhat very optimistic result of it, where people would meet, they would see each other, they would learn from each other, and especially again as you're coming in from a very different environment into the urban environment, for example, that type of a building where you all of a sudden see everyone. And there's also, and with Melnik in particular, you, and also with Golos, this idea of organism. I think that's what he really meant, this idea of organic side of architecture. And he was far less rigid with his form and function. The facade is not, I mean, except for the couple of elements, it's something entirely different on the inside. For him, it was, and I think it is very important, the internal space. You know, how the space functions on the inside, what it looks like, how it's experienced, and that's really the big sort of project that they I think collectively try to address. So, but yeah, no, very important idea. And there's no one answer. That's what makes it fun. There's, you know, it really can. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I have one question.
I just want to say one thing. I really like that sentence. You know, we get from when we are only working with 3 weeks, I think that would be a key. The usefulness of unscripted space, what Anna just said. Please think of that, because if you try to work with 3 weeks to try to, you know, really over program it, also, who's to know? Anyway, that I think I have to leave right now, but I think that's a wonderful ending thought for our projects. Thank you, Anna. Great talk.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.